Chapter 9 of Cranford, by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 9. Signor Brunoni. Soon after the events of which I gave an account in my last paper, I was summoned home by my father's illness, and for a time I forgot, in anxiety about him, to wonder how my dear friends at Cranford were getting on, or how Lady Glenmire could reconcile herself to the dullness of the long visit which she was still paying to her sister-in-law, Mrs Jamieson. When my father grew a little stronger I accompanied him to the seaside, so that altogether I seemed banished from Cranford, and was deprived of the opportunity of hearing any chance intelligence of the dear little town for the greater part of that year. Late in November, when we had returned home again, and my father was once more in good health, I received a letter from Miss Matty, and a very mysterious letter it was. She began many sentences without ending them, running them one into another, in much the same confused sort of way in which written words run together on blotting paper. All I could make out was that, if my father was better, which she hoped he was, and would take warning, and wear a great coat from Michaelmas to Lady Day, if turbans were in fashion, could I tell her? Such a piece of gaiety was going to happen as had not been seen or known of since Wombwell's lions came, when one of them ate a little child's arm, and she was, perhaps, too old to care about dress, but a new cap she must have, and, having heard that turbans were worn, and some of the county families likely to come, she would like to look tidy, if I would bring her a cap from the milliner I employed; and, oh dear, how careless of her to forget that she wrote to beg I would come and pay her a visit next Tuesday, when she hoped to have something to offer me in the way of amusement, which she would not now more particularly describe, only sea green was her favourite colour. So she ended her letter, but in a P.S. she added, she thought she might as well tell me what was the peculiar attraction to Cranford just now. Signor Brunoni was going to exhibit his wonderful magic in the Cranford Assembly Rooms on Wednesday and Friday evening in the following week. I was very glad to accept the invitation from my dear Miss Matty, independently of the conjure, and most particularly anxious to prevent her from disfiguring her small, gentle, mousy face with a great Saracen's head turban; and accordingly I bought her a pretty, neat, middle-aged cap, which, however, was rather a disappointment to her when, on my arrival, she followed me into my bedroom, ostensibly to poke the fire, but in reality, I do believe, to see if the sea-green turban was not inside the cap-box with which I had travelled. It was in vain that I twirled the cap round on my hand to exhibit back and side fronts. Her heart had been set upon a turban, and all she could do was to say, with resignation in her look and voice, "I am sure you did your best, my dear. It is just like the caps all the ladies in Cranford are wearing, and they've had theirs for a year, I daresay. I should have liked something newer, I confess, something more like the turbans Miss Betty Barker tells me Queen Adelaide wears, but it is very pretty, my dear, and I daresay lavender will wear better than sea green. Well, after all, what is a dress that we should care about it? You'll tell me if you want anything, my dear. Here is the bell. I suppose turbans have not gone down to Drumble yet?" So saying, the dear old lady gently bemoaned herself out of the room, leaving me to dress for the evening, when, as she informed me, she expected Miss Pole and Mrs Forrester, and she hoped I should not feel myself too tired to join the party. Of course I should not, and I made some haste to unpack and arrange my dress; but with all my speed, I heard the arrivals and the buzz of conversation in the next room before I was ready. Just as I opened the door, I caught the words, "I was foolish to expect anything very genteel out of the Drumble shops, poor girl. She did her best, I've no doubt." But, for all that, I had rather that she blamed Drumble and me than disfigured herself with a turban. Miss Pole was always the person, in the trio of Cranford ladies now assembled, to have had adventures. She was in the habit of spending the morning in rambling from shop to shop, not to purchase anything, except an occasional reel of cotton, or a piece of tape, but to see the new articles and report upon them, and to collect all the stray pieces of intelligence in the town. She had a way, too, of demurely popping hither and thither into all sorts of places to gratify her curiosity on any point, a way which, if she had not looked so very genteel and prim, might have been considered impertinent. And now, by the expressive way which she cleared her throat, and waited for all minor subjects, such as caps and turbans, to be cleared off the course, we knew she had something very particular to relate, when the due pause came; and I defy people possessed of common modesty to keep up a conversation long, when one among them sits up aloft in silence, looking down upon all the things they chance to say as trivial and contemptible compared to what they could disclose, if properly entreated. Miss Pole began, "As I was stepping out of Gordon's shop to-day, I chanced to go into the George. My Betty has a second-hand cousin who is chambermaid there, and I thought Betty would like to hear how she was, and, not seeing any one about, I strolled up the staircase, and found myself in the passage leading to the Assembly Room. You and I remember the Assembly Room, I'm sure, Miss Matty, and the minuets de la cour. So I went on, not thinking of what I was about, when all at once I perceived that I was in the middle of the preparations for to-morrow night, the room being divided with great clothes-maids, over which Crosby's men were tacking red flannel. Very dark and odd it seemed, it quite bewildered me, and I was going on behind the screens, in my absence of mind, when a gentleman, quite the gentleman I can assure you, stepped forwards and asked if I had any business he could arrange for me. He spoke such pretty, broken English, I could not help thinking of Thaddeus of Warsaw, and the Hungarian brothers, and Santo Sebastiani, and while I was busy picturing his past life to myself, he had bowed me out of the room. But wait a minute, you have not heard half my story yet. I was going downstairs, when who should I meet but Betty's second cousin. So of course I stopped to speak to her for Betty's sake, and she told me that I had really seen the conjuror. The gentleman who spoke broken English was Signor Brunoni himself. Just at this moment he passed us on the stairs, making such a graceful bow, in reply to which I dropped a curtsy. All foreigners have such polite manners, one catches something of it. But when he had gone downstairs, I bethought me that I had dropped my glove in the Assembly Room. It was safe in the muff all the time, but I never found it till afterwards, so I went back, and just as I was creeping up the passage left on one side of the great screen that goes nearly across the room, who should I see but the very same gentleman that had met me before, and passed me on the stairs, coming now forwards from the inner part of the room, to which there is no entrance, you remember, Miss Matty, and just repeating, in his pretty broken English, the inquiry if I had any business there. I don't mean that he put it so bluntly, but he seemed very determined that I should not pass the screen. So of course I explained about my glove, which, curiously enough, I found at that very moment. Miss Pole, then, had seen the conjuror, the real live conjuror, and numerous were the questions we all asked her. Had he a beard? Was he young or old? Fair or dark? Did he look— Unable to shape my question prudently, I put it in another form. How did he look? In short, Miss Pole was the heroine of the evening, owing to her morning's encounter. If she was not the rose, that is to say, the conjuror, she had been near it. Conjuration, sleight of hand, magic, witchcraft were the subjects of the evening. Miss Pole was slightly sceptical, and inclined to think that there might be a scientific solution found even for the proceedings of the Witch of Endor. Mrs Forrester believed everything, from ghosts to death-watches. Miss Matty ranged between the two, always convinced by the last speaker. I think she was naturally more inclined to Mrs Forrester's side, but a desire of proving herself a worthy sister to Miss Jenkyns kept her equally balanced. Miss Jenkyns, who would never allow a servant to call the little rolls of tallow that formed themselves round candles winding-sheets, but insisted on their being spoken of as roly-polies. A sister of hers to be superstitious! It would never do. After tea, I was dispatched downstairs into the dining-parlour for that volume of the old encyclopaedia which contained the nouns beginning with C, in order that Miss Pole might prime herself with scientific explanations for the tricks of the following evening. It spoilt the pool at preference which Miss Matty and Mrs Forrester had been looking forward to, for Miss Pole became so much absorbed in her subject, and the plates by which it was illustrated, that we felt it would be cruel to disturb her otherwise than by one or two well-timed yawns, which I threw in now and then, for I was really touched by the meek way in which the two ladies were bearing their disappointment. But Miss Pole only read the more zealously, imparting to us no more information than this. "Ah! I see, I comprehend perfectly. A represents the ball. Put A between B and D— no, between C and F, and turn the second joint of the third finger of your left hand over the wrist of your right. H. Very clever indeed. My dear Mrs Forrester, conjuring and witchcraft is a mere affair of the alphabet. Do let me read you this one passage." Mrs Forrester implored Mrs Pole to spare her, saying, from a child upwards, she could never understand being read aloud to, and I dropped the pack of cards, which I had been shuffling very audibly, and by this discreet movement I observed Miss Pole to perceive that preference was to have been the order of the evening, and to propose, rather unwillingly, that the pool should commence. the pleasant brightness that stole over the other two ladies' faces on this. Miss Matty had one or two